Question 1. What is VAT? Answer. VAT is a consumption tax charged on most goods and services traded for use or consumption in the EU. It is levied on the value added to the product at each stage of production and distribution. The value added means the difference between the cost of inputs into the product, service and the price at which it is sold to the consumer. VAT is charged when VAT-registered taxable businesses sell to other businesses (B2B) or to the final consumer (B2C). VAT is intended to be neutral in that businesses are able to reclaim any VAT that they pay on goods or services. Ultimately, the final consumer should be the only one who is actually taxed. Businesses are given a VAT identification number and have to show the VAT charged to customers on the invoices. In the EU, there is a minimum standard VAT rate of 15%, above which member states are free to set their own national VAT rates. Member states decide how to spend the revenue they receive from VAT receipts, except for a small percentage of this total which is paid towards the EU budget. Question 2. How does the current EU VAT system work? Answer. Currently, a transitional system is in place for VAT on intra-EU transactions. See below. Under this system, when it comes to cross-border sales between businesses, VAT is collected in the member state of destination, i.e. where the goods are sent to or where the recipient of services is established in line with the rate and conditions of that country. This means that the supplier of goods or services does not charge VAT, but the recipient is responsible for paying it. Both the supplier and recipient must conform to special reporting obligations. It should be noted that there are many exceptions to these rules. For example, VAT on transport is paid where the transport occurs and VAT on cultural events occurs where the show takes place. The rules for intra-EU transactions differ from purely domestic transactions, where the supplier charges VAT and is responsible for paying it to the treasury. The divergence between domestic and intra-EU rules for VAT poses problems for the single market, as it creates additional burdens for businesses operating cross-border and exposes the VAT system to fraud for goods or services provided to private individuals, i.e. business to customer. The taxation is the same for intra-EU transactions as it is for domestic transactions, i.e. the VAT is paid by the supplier in the member state where the sale occurs or where the supplier is established. However, there are certain supply for which different rules apply, for example distance sales, new means of transport, certain services, etc. Question 3. How much revenue is raised through VAT every year in the EU? Answer. In 2008, total VAT receipts in the EU were around EUR 862 billion. VAT receipts accounted for 21.4% of the national tax revenues of EU member states, including social security contributions, a rise of 12% since 1995. It is thus a major source of revenue for national budgets, and in many member states it is the main source. VAT receipts represented in 2008 on average 7.8% of the GDP of a member state, a figure that has increased by almost 13% from 1995. Since the recession, the share of VAT revenues as part of total receipts has probably grown further in most EU countries. Question 4. How much of this revenue goes towards the EU budget? Answer. VAT is part of the own resources of the EU budget, and member states pay a small percentage of their total VAT receipts to the EU currently. This contribution from member states is based on rate 0.3% of the national harmonized VAT base, with temporary reduced rates over 2007 to 2013 of 0.225% for Austria, 0.15% for Germany and 0.1% for the Netherlands and Sweden. In 2010 it represents €14 billion. Question 5. Why is there a transitional system in place for VAT at the moment? Answer. In 1967, the Council undertook a legal and political commitment to introduce a VAT system tailored to the single market and operated across member states in the same way as within a single country. To complete the internal market by 1993, the Commission put forward proposals based on taxation in the country of origin, with a harmonized rate structure and a clearing mechanism for the redistribution of VAT receipts to the member state where consumption takes place. However, given the lack of consensus and the need for goods to be able to pass freely within the EU while still allowing member states to collect the tax revenue, the Council instead adopted a transitional system. The transitional system has enabled controls of goods at the EU's internal borders to be abolished whilst allowing tax to be collected in the member state of destination at the rate and under the conditions of that country. This system was only supposed to last for 4 years, but member states have been been unable to come to agreement on a more permanent system based on taxation in the member state where the goods originate. It is now high time to tackle the uncertainty about the future of the current so-called transitional VAT system and to choose a stable and definitive system by taking into account the views of all stakeholders as to the best way forward. Question 6. Why is there an EU minimum VAT rate? Answer. A minimum EU VAT rate was established to coincide with the creation of the EU single market, which meant that fiscal controls at internal borders were no longer carried out. This minimum rate helps to avoid substantial variations in member states' VAT rates, which could lead to distortions of competition between high and low rate countries and put the smooth functioning of single market at risk. The minimum level for the VAT rate has been fixed at 15% since 1992. With regular review of this rate, member states are free to set their own rate at or above this minimum. Question 7. What are the rules with regard to reduced VAT rates and what type of goods and services can benefit from these rates? Answer. EU rules allow member states the option of applying one or two reduced rates to a restricted list of goods and services, which are set out in Annex 3 to the VAT Directive. The reduced rate cannot be less than 5%, and the list of eligible goods and services must be strictly interpreted. Some examples of goods eligible for a lower rate include foodstuffs, medicines, medical equipment for the disabled, books on all physical means of support, newspapers, periodicals, passenger transport, and admission to shows, theaters, museums, etc. Some examples of services eligible for a reduced rate include the transport of passengers and their accompanying luggage, admission to shows, theaters, circuses, fairs, amusement parks, concerts, museums, zoos, cinemas, exhibitions and similar cultural events and facilities, renovation of housing as part of a social policy, etc. In addition, there is a multitude of derogations on the application of zero rates, super reduced rates lower than 5%, and reduced rates for products or services not usually eligible. This makes the whole system complicated and open to misinterpretation. Question 8. What is the situation with regard to VAT exemptions? What is exempt and why? Answer. Supplies falling under a category exempt from VAT are sold to the buyer, normally a final consumer, without any VAT being applied to that sale. Exemptions from tax include, for example, certain activities in the public interest, medical care, school education, etc., or certain insurance and financial services. Reasons behind the exemptions vary. At the time the exemptions were granted, some activities were only carried out by public authorities. For some other it was very difficult to determine the taxable basis. For some others the VAT was too much of a burden, administratively or financially. However, as the supply is exempt from VAT, deduction of the VAT paid on the inputs is not possible. For example, postal services are at present exempt from VAT, so if someone sends a parcel using the post office he is not charged VAT, but the post office has paid VAT on its inputs, the vans it uses, the post boxes it buys, and all the other things. It cannot reclaim or deduct this VAT, so a part of the value of the stamps you bought to send the parcel represents paying this hidden VAT.